Schneider with the University of Central Arkansas. Last year, our panel, if you remember, Dr. Horton, who's on actually the program here, Dr. Horton, but actually, I don't know why. It's just a tradition, Marshall, so, but next year you'll be on the panel again.
Thanks.
But Dr. Rice, but if I remember last year, I think the panel had kind of a not so rosy picture of the future, but there was a lot of uncertainty, right? We didn't know who would win the election and that kind of thing. There's a lot of uncertainty there. I'm not saying that if we knew who would win, that we would change our expectations, but maybe this year we'll have a rosy picture of the future, who knows. But we have a great panel, a large panel, a great panel. I'll introduce them. So starting, I guess, on your right, we have Mr. Caleb McMahon. He's the Director of Economic Development for the Economic Development Alliance for Jefferson County here. So he'll give us the local flair here. But he's also worked in China for quite some time, so maybe give an international perspective as well. And then we have Dr. Michael Paco. He's the Chief Economist and State Economic Forecaster at the Arkansas Economic Development Institute, AEDI, located at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. Then we know Mr. Tom Chilton from the AEDC, so we have AEDI, AEDC. And then we have Dr. Jeremy Horpedahl, an economics professor at the University of Central Arkansas. He does a lot of work for the Arkansas Center for Research and Economics, or the ACRE, ACRE. And then we have someone, maybe we'll say with a real job, not to get, but Mr. Kelton Harrison, Vice President and Chief Portfolio Strategist for Simmons Bank there in Conway. So I appreciate the panel volunteering their time. So we'll get started with a very easy question, but I think maybe Dr. Paco, you may take the lead on this one. Kind of your job, I suppose, right? So
yeah.
Before we talk about the future, how is the Arkansas economy doing right now? What is the strength and what is a weakness in the economy?
Does this microphone work? No, I guess not. How about now? Can you hear me okay? Okay, there we go. Well, you know, I was at the National Association for Business Economics earlier this week, and a similar question was posed to Austin Goolsbee, and his answer was 2.25%. That's the answer. And I think that's the national economic outlook. That's pretty much what we are seeing in Arkansas as well. Our economic growth is proceeding commensurate with the national average, whether you look at employment or income. The things are pretty much on an even keel, slow and steady growth. We never experienced a V-shaped recovery after the financial crisis and recession, but we've simply kind of dropped a level and proceeded with growth along a path. I'd say there are a couple of imbalances in our economic growth pattern in Arkansas in particular. One is that although we're seeing income growth at about the same pace as the nation as a whole, more of it is concentrated in the category of dividends, interest, and rent, and a much smaller component on wages and salaries. So for those concerned about income inequality, I think that's an indication that the recent trends, at least since 2010, have been skewed more toward the incomes of higher income households than, say, the working class, middle class households. Probably even a more stark difference or an imbalance is the distribution of growth around the state geographically. Well, as on average as a state, we're growing about the same pace as the nation. Most of that growth is concentrated in a couple of areas. Northwest Arkansas, a perennial growth magnet, but we're also seeing very strong advances in Jonesboro, and being the diversified political base capital city, Little Rock is growing at about the statewide average. But if you look around the rest of the state, there's population growth, job growth is negative in 2/3 of the counties in Arkansas, and we're only seeing both population and job growth really in the metropolitan areas, the metropolitan counties, about 1/3 of the state's counties. But that's kind of how I would summarize things right now.
Is there anything else anyone would like to add to that? 2.25%.
2.25.
So I guess the next question is, what does the future look like for Arkansas? I don't know. I know you're
Sure,
you're the forecaster officially, so maybe this time someone will follow you.
Well, okay. Forecasting a recession is almost an impossible job, I guess, and that's what most people think about when they think about what the forecast of the future holds. I think we're right now on a fairly nondescript trend path of growth. Absent any surprises, I would expect more of the same. So other than the unconditional probability of a downturn that always exists when you're looking at the future, I don't think there's any real danger signs or anything like that on the horizon. In terms of opportunities, I guess what we're seeing a lot of activity with small firms, international investment in particular, coming to the state. And I think those are the promising opportunities of the future. But nothing really earth-shattering. Let's just put it this way: I don't expect Amazon's new headquarters to be in Arkansas.
That's a safe bet.
Yeah. Mr. McMahon.
Sure. I would add to that. He did touch on something where I think we will see some significant growth, and we have seen some so far, is with international investment. Actually, Arkansas had the largest growth percentage-wise in international investment of any other state last year, I believe. Now, that can be misleading to a degree, because if you only have very little economic international investment and it doubles, the percentage, it can be misleading. But that being said, we have seen a very large influx of international groups coming into China. Coming into Arkansas from China. I believe we're dealing with probably 4 or 5 different groups just this last year or so. I'm currently working with a group out of Suzhou that has just recently located here in Pine Bluff, and we've been targeting some of our efforts in that area. So if there is any outlier and kind of some silver lining there, I think that the land cost here lends itself to international investment.
Mr. Harrison, from Simmons Bank perspective, I guess, how do you see the future?
Well, thank you, Professor Snyder, and thank you for having me here. I'm not an economist like my esteemed panelist colleagues here, but from the bank's perspective, it largely depends on what's going on. I spoke with several of our bank community presidents around the state, as well as our regional chairman for overall state. Our regional chairman has a lot of experience in the southeastern part of the state. He said that there was quite a bit of concern about our farmers. He had expressed concern about the price of various commodity products in the farming sector not being all that great, but this particular year, yield increasing, and therefore giving the farmers another year to squeak by. But that's always been a concern in the Delta area of our economy. Other areas of the economy, as mentioned already, of course, Northwest Arkansas is going rather strongly. One thing that we have noticed, of course, is that as more people have been moving into the area, single-family homes have been built, but the supply is dwindling relative to the demand. There's also a lot of multifamily housing being built, and there was some concern about, is it going to be overbuilt in Northwest Arkansas? Now, of course, there's many things that are going on in Northwest Arkansas. One thing that was pointed out in particular is entertainment and arts and culture being emphasized. More of that coming in, and as incomes increase in that area of the state, there will be more demand for that type of service for the local community. Did also hear from some of our folks in the Fort Smith area. Fort Smith has been challenged for some time. It, of course, is still the second largest city in the state, but the growth there has not been quite as good. Now, some peripheral areas, such as Greenwood and Van Buren, have seen year over year quite a bit more growth in their housing as people have moved to these areas. One dynamic that is interesting in the Fort Smith area is the school district of Greenwood comes into and takes up part of Fort Smith. So people who live in Fort Smith may actually be in the Greenwood School District. And it's an odd thing that the local governments, of course, don't have control over where those boundaries are set. And so that's influencing where people are moving. And the Little Rock area, some of the concerns from the bankers there are positive things going on, of course, in the Little Rock area. It's still, Central Arkansas is the largest MSA in the state. So there are many opportunities. One of the bankers, though, I spoke to mentioned what many bankers might say, that this area is overbanked. There's too much competition. Well, yeah, that might be to be expected from a banker, but on the other hand, if you don't have the economic growth that you're experiencing, say, in Northwest Arkansas, there's just more competition for fewer loans out there. Another concern is found in maintaining deposits. One of our bankers up in Northeast Arkansas has expressed concern about maintaining and growing our deposits to meet loan demand, as bank customers have shifted some of their deposits to other areas, whether it be equity securities, brokerage securities that are debt-based. And so that's a concern. The bank itself has been, as you all are probably aware, has been, through the past several years, been growing rapidly. Our chairman and CEO, George Macris, has taken on you might say, a more aggressive viewpoint toward growing the bank as we've expanded outside Arkansas.
Thank you. Sure. So Mr. Chilton, so you talked a lot about what the government is trying to do to help stimulate jobs and economic growth. Maybe I'll ask Dr. Horpedahl, what are the pros and cons of the policy that is being promoted by the AEDC?
Well, it's a good question. Economic development it's a very hard thing to do, as I'm sure these two gentlemen can tell you. It's very hard to even know what the research says works. I study economic history, and for those that don't study it, you may not know, there's still a very contentious debate about actually what caused the Industrial Revolution, which is the first kind of economic development. So if we don't know, we can't explain that, can we really understand how we can make jobs grow in Arkansas over the next year? But I see there's kind of two strategies of economic development. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but two different policies you can follow. One is kind of targeted economic development, where you are trying to directly attract firms to come here, trying to provide incentives for firms to do certain things, job creation, capital investment. The other strategy is to provide a kind of system where entrepreneurs are free to make investments where they see opportunities, but there's no kind of central direction to it. And of course, you can pursue both these at the same time. And I think we've done a lot of the first, of trying to attract firms into, for either whether they're international firms or firms just from other states trying to locate facilities here. But I think we've been kind of lagging on the second one, which is to have a general climate of low taxes, tolerable regulations, and that sort. And I know there's a lot of work in the legislature right now trying to move in that direction. But if we look at things such as our corporate tax rate, it's the second highest in the South. If we look at something like occupational licensing, we have the second highest occupational licensing burden in the country by some measures. And I think these are some things which, along with other economic development policies, we really need to look at pursuing. And I think there is some taste for that right now among policymakers, but it's turning out to be actually very hard to do for some reason. I think we can identify what some of those reasons are. But I think that's kind of the challenge, is to, in addition to all the other things we're doing, and try and identify what strategies have worked in the past and what others haven't, as far as targeted economic development, to have a more broad strategy that doesn't try to target anything specifically, but creates the environment where entrepreneurs can thrive, and businesses will come here not because they were necessarily targeted, but just because it looks attractive in general. I think that's where Arkansas really needs to get moving, because lots of other states are moving on these things, cutting both corporate and individual tax rates, reforming various regulations, not just occupational regulation, but others as well. And I hope that's something that in the very near future we really start moving on.
And Mr. Chilton, I don't know if you want to add to that or not, but you mentioned taxes at the end of your talk. Do you have in mind what type of tax reform that you're referring to?
Well, one of the things that is currently underway is the governor's initiative led by the legislature to reevaluate our tax structure. As Dr. Paco will tell you, taxation is kind of an evil force. It works for good and bad all at the same time. And one thing that tends to be forgotten is you have to look at the totality of taxing when you're talking about taxing. And yes, we do have high corporate tax. That I comfortably feel will be addressed. We've allowed that to get out of control. We do still, however, have a demand for providing capital to the public sector, and with all of the requirements that we have there. So again, I feel confident that we're looking at those kinds of things. The issue is, how do you politically provide reduction in taxes to corporations, but then not to the individual as well, and then vice versa. So it's a real tightrope to have to walk. I'm thankful that he didn't ask me to sit on that particular committee, but bottom line is there are some very diligent people working on that, and hopefully soon we'll have answers. We can't do anything about it until the next time that the full legislative session is in panel, but I do believe that you will see some things come from that.
And I think, Dr. Horpedahl, I believe you, according to your research, you have some ideas about taxes, right? So what in general was the, I guess, summary of tax reform that you wrote about in your book?
Oh, yes, I forgot that. I wrote a book. So there's copies out there, along with some economists at the Tax Foundation out in Washington, D.C. We wrote this book, about 100 pages, of just an overview of Arkansas's economy and tax system, looking at each of the tax types, as well as having recommendations for reform. We put together a variety of different plans, some more, requiring a lot more political lifting than others. But basically the plans are designed to either get the top tax rate down to either 6 or 7%, or excuse me, down to 5 or 6%, back where it was before 1971. And doing that for the most part by eliminating various exemptions and credits that may be targeted in some way in the tax code. And so we've really just put together a few different ideas as to how that might be done. And as far as this task force, which is going to be ongoing for they have a year left now. They've been meeting for 6 months, but they've finally chosen a consultant after 6 months. So hopefully now they'll actually start doing the work. But we hope to have some input, as lots of groups are going to have input into that, as well as not just academic input, but from the public as well and private sector. And we hope that whatever comes out of it, that lowering top rates, that's kind of a headline thing that's done as well, but also cleaning up and simplifying the code, making it conform more to the federal tax code, especially with corporate. That's actually probably even more important than getting the rate down, is conformity with the federal code in a lot of ways that we don't do now. So that we've got 108 pages of ideas there. So if you want to read it, and we can talk later. But that's what the basic plans look at, trying to get Arkansas to that place where getting down to 5%, both on the corporate and individual side, would get us so we're either even with or below all our neighbors, other than the two that have no income tax. So that's kind of the broad outline.
Just don't buy property there.
Are you taking questions from the audience?
I was going to, maybe last 15 minutes, but if you want to ask a question now, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Kind of an open question to anyone. Besides taxes, is there any other, if you were in charge of Arkansas state government, what policies would you change or consider changing that you think may be affecting the economy?
I'm not sure this is a change, but an additional emphasis that I think is important for economic development is making sure that we have a workforce that is prepared for the jobs that are hopefully on the horizon. This issue of the Amazon headquarters has made big splash headlines all over the country. I think the mayor of Little Rock has said he'd like to put in a bid, and that's ambitious and great. But I think there's a couple of aspects of the competition that goes for those kind of big development projects. One is, I think it's bad if we end up with communities competing against one another down to the lowest common denominator. How much can we pay them to come come to our community. But on the other hand, it's a positive force if it inspires communities to say, well, why can't we get a big employer like that to come to our area? Let's look at the skills that our workforce has, what kind of infrastructure is available, focus on the real aspects of what can make economic development happen, and if you build it, they will come, rather than trying to pay them to come and build it for themselves. I think that's probably a much wiser strategy. And in addition to the Tax Reform Commission that's going on, there is also a joint committee on workforce development that is also looking at those kind of issues. And I think those are two complementary directions for development that are happening in the government right now in Arkansas.
I do want to echo what he's saying with regards to workforce development, because as we see groups come into this area, the number one problem that we do have is workforce. Speaking of Amazon, for example, they need 50,000 highly trained workers, right? Now, who is Amazon's biggest competitor? Walmart. Walmart has 45,000 employees in the state. They would be directly competing for those jobs, so that's another reason they're not going to come here. But as well, when people are looking to locate into Jefferson County or into Little Rock, if those numbers start to reach into a very specific skill set in that 20 and 30,000 employee range, some of these big headquarters, or just you've seen like Foxconn and those types of things going to Wisconsin, we do not have the trained workforce. And it's something that we're doing where I work, where we are about to start pivoting our strategy to start spending money to work with the high schools and colleges to start working with companies to do some specific training. Because there's a lot of industries here who have an 80 and 90% turnover rate, and that is staggering.
A follow-up on that. So when you're, I know training, it seems to be a long-term goal, right? Start in high school or even before high school. How do we know in the future what jobs are going to be there? I mean, some people say we need to bring our manufacturing back, or or we need app developers, right? So how do we know what we need to train these young folks?
That's an excellent question. I mean, and I wish I could answer it. But that being said, me personally, and this is my opinion, and I think there's a lot of people out there who probably share this opinion, but I feel like Arkansas has been going after a economic development plan that was put together in the 20th century. We still chase smokestacks for the most part in the state. I think we really need to look at pivoting and training towards technology and a high skill set, because this is going to get some groans, but the United States is not a manufacturing economy anymore. It's just not. It's a service economy. And we need to either adapt or learn how to grow our own business. And I think we should be developing entrepreneurs. I think we should be going to high skills trades, research and development, and those types of things. But that specific answer of what will that be and what will it look like, if I had that answer, I would probably have a lot more money.
I was just going to add to that again, on the workforce development, I was looking at some statistics recently on educational attainment in Arkansas, and among Arkansas and our neighboring states, we are number one in achievement of high school graduation. But that's what I mean by that is we are the highest proportion of those who that's their terminal point, is having reached a high school degree. If you compare us with our neighboring states, including Texas, Louisiana, Missouri, we're in last place when it comes to bachelor's degrees. So that's, I think, an important next step that we need to take in education. When you look at the skills that are required in today's marketplace and the future, I think it might be a misleading statement to say we're no longer a manufacturing economy, because we are still manufacturing goods. We're just not employing people in the manufacturing sector. Automation, robotics has made it so that the jobs in manufacturing are no longer unskilled physical labor, but operating the computers and machines that make the stuff. And so those skills are increasingly important, and ones that we should be focusing on when we look at developing for the industries of the future.
Clearly, there has been criticism relative to the kind of smokestack mentality. And as Dr. Paco said, it's not so much that we're not seeing the opportunities in manufacturing. What opportunities look like in manufacturing are a lot different today than they were in 1970. And so, yes, we're still pursuing those kinds of opportunities because that's really more or less in the economic world the low-hanging fruit. It does not mean, however, we're stuck and focused only on that. I think that the workforce is the number one problem that we have relative to going forward. That's why the governor chose to put an economic developer in charge of the workforce cabinet, of which there's a large diversity of group there. But at the end of the day, it's going to be about education. We have had a weakness in education for far too long, and although there are lots of reforms going on, we still have a long ways to go, and we need to be thinking in terms of a diversity of education and not just everybody focused on the same things. And in order to get those skill sets, as my colleague to my right said, we're going to have to take the focus off of only obtaining a high school degree. Used to be in the 50s, you had to get the high school degree to get a job. This is 2017. that has changed remarkably. So there is a transition that goes on. From a political standpoint, we have to look towards providing jobs for all Arkansans. We still have too many in the unskilled category, but we're seeing that change. It's transformational, transitional, whatever you want to call it, but it is a struggle that we have mightily each day.
A follow-up to that, I mentioned in your talk that, and other people have mentioned this, that when people do become high skilled, they go somewhere else, Dallas or some other state. Now, at the same time, we hear that these new businesses or high-tech businesses say that we don't have the workforce. So, so what? I guess is there a solution there? We have folks that are leaving after we train them to stay. Is there? Any
Well, it's one of those things that it works best when it simultaneously happens because there's not a chicken and an egg here kind of a thing. But I will tell you that, but again, it's limited to our largest MSA areas. But we are starting to see the entrepreneurs pick up, and they are finding the smaller numbers that they need to see their business grow. The difficulty is when you start getting into the level of a privacy star or even to a mega requirement like Axiom has, to how do you find all of those people? And the reality is, part of it has to be organic. We've got to grow those. But the other part of it is we've got to create this quality of life that gets communicated. And that's one of the things that I didn't go into was we have this massive push now within the Economic Development Commission. We've doubled the marketing budget because one of the things we've got to do is improve our messaging and also take more advantage of the new methodology for sending your message, which is the digital world. We're working on those things that will hopefully attract a larger capacity of workforce, especially in the high-skilled areas, and especially in those that we're trying to target that we feel like we have some competitive advantages on.
somewhat follow-up, but does anyone have any ideas for education reform, K through 12?
How long do we have? There's no way of getting around it. That's one of the black eyes in Arkansas. It has been for some time. We're seeing improvement. I think across the landscape within our universities, we're hearing that test scores are up. Not so much in the math area, but the bottom line is we are at least seeing an upward trend. The chancellor who was here earlier, we were talking about, we're seeing some interesting things. We're seeing more students coming back into the system and staying determination, but we're seeing fewer students start the system. And, those are trends that we're going to have to evaluate and understand a little better. But I put it to you this way. You can't hardly be a great state if you don't have a great city or at least a great geographical area. And when you look at the largest MSA that we've got in the school system is under either federal control or state control off and on, that's a problem. And you add to that crime. And the crime is a huge economic negative. And part of the thing is we haven't managed our message outward about our crime problems because they're actually more or less, depending on where you are in the United States. So again, it goes back to economic development is a complicated study. You know, it's part dazzling brilliance, but mostly voodoo. And we do the best that we can do with that voodoo. We do so well, I guess. But the bottom line is, those would be the things I would think. On the educational side is we're going to have to take some hard, realistic looks at what it's going to take to change the dialogue there.
Let me just raise a question. When you mentioned crime, would you also suggest that there are many people in the Trump administration who are criminals?
I'm not competent to respond to that, I think, but, you know, the bottom line is the crime is a problem in our state, and it's one that we're going to have to deal with.
Well, I think you're concentrating on inner city crime. I think it's like a code word, whereas we understand that crime goes all the way up. Like the Wall Street crime is a big thing. What took place 2008, 2009 is very, very big, and nobody went to jail unless it was a guy who was over countrywide. But basically, the Wall Street criminals got away clean, and they knew they were breaking the law when they did it. But when people talk about crime in the U.S., they're mainly focusing on black folks and what's going on in the city, and ignoring all the white-collar crime that's taking place all over the country. I actually had some other concerns. When you mentioned, like your bank is, you said the inner city was overbanked. Oh, you can't hear me back here? Oh, you mentioned that the inner city was overbanked. Is there a difference in overbanked and redlining?
Well,
Redlining is when they just draw a red line around a certain area. And just to make it clear, what black folks are, is that we're not gonna lend over here. So the banks really don't wanna lend there. I'll give you some examples. I own some properties in Little Rock, around Eula. Okay, one went up to 87,000, came back down to 50 something, and now it's at 61 something. Another, which is just a great house, but it's also 2 blocks away, it just keeps going up, up, up. But there are properties all over the city that have gone up to like 85,000, 80,000. But if you look at Zillow, they're back down to 31,000. Okay, so there's something going on there in terms of maybe, you know, the banks are looking out and saying that times are hard. In other words, this economy is overdue for a recession in terms of the usual end. So maybe they're saying, well, you know, we can essentially buy these properties up at a very low price, so we're not gonna make loans on them at those early higher prices.
well, and I'm
But
sorry.
my
I don't know
question
what-
was the difference in redlining and overbanked. I like that backwards.
I'm sorry, I don't have any specific information on that. And as far as the, you know, overbanked in the inner city, that the person who mentioned overbanked was not referring specifically to the inner city in any one particular area. His concern is that from the bank's perspective, or a business's perspective, any business, that as market forces take, or economic forces may take opportunities lower, and yet the number of competitors going after those opportunities goes up, that's the feeling of being overbanked. Now, some of that is, of course, just personal feeling. And what is there a definition for being overbanked or not? No, not that I know of. And you would expect that anyone who's in a competitive business environment would want to obviously see less competition. They'd want to make more loans. They'd want to bring in more deposits. And as far as redlining, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
So I'd like to ask you a question. I think the definition of overbanked is more than one bank on a corner. As a former banker, that's how I felt. But I'm really interested in Simmons and other gentlemen's take on the financial sector in Arkansas. This is about economic status and future in the Trump era, and Dodd-Frank potential repeal, increase in interest rates, going to increase margin. You know, we've got several public institutions that are just growing wildly in Arkansas. How do you see that impacting our state more broadly? Because these public institutions and Arvest, for example, are growing wildly, and I'm curious what potential impact you think that may have on the state.
Well, as far as what Simmons has experienced, a lot of our growth, of course, has been outside the state of Arkansas, going over into Tennessee and Missouri, and we've announced potential acquisitions in Oklahoma and Texas and Colorado, branches that go into these areas. The lowering of regulations on any industry, including the financial services industry, would tend to increase the activity in that industry because it takes away some of the expense of doing your job. As a side effect, however, everything has consequences. Lower regulations give opportunities for rule breakers to maybe get away with some things. It's a very disturbing thing that we've seen in recent months is what's happened at Wells Fargo. And that was a practice that had been going on for some time. And no one wants to see it. As a matter of fact, at Simmons, we took a proactive step to back off of our incentive program when that came out. So we want to make sure that we do the right thing. Part of our culture is do the right thing. So a lot of it has to do with individual companies, their individual cultures. But I think if we do have any kind of reduction in regulatory environment, it will help the banks. Now, as far as interest rates go, that's a very interesting question. We've seen recently a slight uptick in rates per the Federal Reserve, the overnight lending rates to banks. We had, though, for some time now seen quite a pronounced increase in the 2-year Treasury rate. However, on the other hand, we have not seen that in the 30-year Treasury, the long bond. And there are competing forces that at work here. One of the big forces that have contributed, in my opinion, to lower interest rates, which we have seen coming on since 1981. We've had lower rates, lower rates. It's been going on for a huge bond bull market. Lower rates, higher bond prices, is an increase in debt. There are some folks out there who have talked about the debt burden, not only in this country, but worldwide, contributing to a compression in interest rates. Now, in my job, what we're doing in Simmons Wealth Management, of course, we're managing money for folks. And so we're having to watch shorter term trends. And we can see sometimes when the interest rate on a certain, say the 10-year, just a few days ago started spiking back up. When it failed to go down through a certain level, 2%, we were looking at 2%. During some of those time periods, you can have movement, but the long-term trend is still lower rates, generally speaking. Now, can it go lower? It can. I wouldn't expect us to see rates go lower, lower, lower. I mean, what are we going to have? 5 basis points on a 30-year Treasury bond? No, I don't think so. So it's possible that we could have a long period of slowly rising rates. The last time that rates were this low was around 1941. It took 40 years for rates to peak out in the early 80s. 40 years. But that has, again, there are always consequences. For savers, that has an impact on the amount of interest that they get from their savings vehicles. As more people retire, Jim Shinup, who's here with me today from the bank, he'd mentioned that the demographic of those turning 65 will, I believe it's, Jim, did you say it's 10,000 people per month? Per day, 10,000 people per day in this country turning 65. Generally speaking, those who are retired want to have their money into safer, interest-yielding, dividend-yielding type investments. If the rates aren't there to support an income coming from those investments, where are they going to turn? It will have impacts on risk-taking and capital markets as more money goes into riskier assets. So it's a very complicated issue. I'm not sure if I fully addressed your question.
So I appreciate those comments. That's good, but I really kind of would also ask you or other panelists to address the impact to the state of this boom that we've really seen in the last few years in the financial sector.
Good. Well, I'll let some of the other panelists a chance at answering that question.
I don't have anything to say about that, but I did want to address the crime question, so if anyone wants to take this one. No, I think this is a real concern, and I think there's a lot of ways in which this intersects with some of the economic issues we've talked about. Dr. Snyder actually just had an op-ed in the Democrat Gazette 3 days ago, on the relationship between occupational licensing and how that prevents people who have been in the criminal justice system in some way, in many cases, from ever getting a job again. how that leads to increases in property crime rates. And so we really look at how some of these economic regulations, which seem kind of, oh, regulation, bad or good, whatever we think, that actually has real social consequences. And we're starting to see some emerging research showing the real effects of economic regulation on these social factors like crime. And when you really look how that affects different groups, we have research going on that, both by Dr. Snyder as well as outside experts we've hired at our research center. Other things like civil asset forfeiture, which we don't really even think of as an economic issue, does really have a disparate effect on minorities, and in some way connects with that, getting them, once they're in the criminal justice system, it's often very hard once you come out to get a job, because a lot of times the occupational regulations prevent you, if you have felony on your record, from even entering certain occupations, which are occupations which people without much skills would enter. So I think we do need to think about how all these things relate to each other, and how that might be holding the state as a whole back, especially certain groups. So I think it's a really good concern.
We're officially open to questions, by the way. So Dr. Rice was.
I'd like to take the conversation back to job creation. Over the last 30, 40 years, Arkansas lost a lot of apparel manufacturing to outsourcing. As wages increased in some of these countries where this took place, I believe that there'll be some insourcing in the areas of consumer goods that need to be manufactured somewhere, like flatware or apparel. Have we, I guess, Mr. Chilton, have we thought about any strategy to be ready to take on this transformation if, in fact, it were to happen?
Well, in point of fact, oh, thank you. In point of fact, we are seeing that happen. The question that concerns us, and concerns me in particular, is that something that will be sustainable, or will we see what happened with the growth in the 70s only to be lost, by the early 90s, as we made certain investments in that area. We don't try to pick favorites, because we found over time when we do that, we generally come up with a lost cause. But we are seeing some apparel. There has been an announcement that in eastern Arkansas there is an apparel company working in conjunction with Nike and others to kind of reintroduce some apparel manufacturing back to the state. We are seeing the use of our commodities, in particular, some of the potential for the cotton to be utilized in some of that manufacturing. The issue really comes down to this: as we move into this world where more and more things will be machine driven by an artificial intelligence, how much can we put an emphasis on the development of jobs in an area that we know ultimately will be abandoned? And so how we keep the skills fresh, how we keep the people aligned with those jobs, how we deal with the federal government and how they deal with immigration, which is a huge thing to our manufacturing as well as our agriculture. Those are all things that we're having to kind of weigh every day, even as we're trying not to pick favorites and utilize only incentives when they're appropriate and create the kind of best opportunity for a rate of return to the Arkansas taxpayer. I don't know, I probably jumped around your question there, but we are seeing the trend of some of that come back. We have embraced some of it. Some of it is of a concern of how long can it be sustainable.
Thank you.
Hey, Thomas Piketty wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century. Okay, I only have the 2010 edition. I had to wait because I can't read French. It's in English. Okay, so in it, he deals with the idea of the capital income ratio. And just based on the numbers, I mean, if you assume that there's, say, 5% return on capital and a 2% return to the economy as a whole, then in about 45 years, just plug the numbers in, you're going to end up with those who own capital basically owning and eating everything that's produced, and everybody else getting nothing. So number one, we know that's not going to happen. That is, people are going to tear up the earth first, which is what we begin to see based in a lot of different countries. But some of the leaders of the tech companies, you know, the CEOs of Facebook, Tesla, Richard Branson, SpaceX, have suggested a guaranteed basic income because they're looking out and saying, well, we've got these 6 million jobs that are unfilled. But when you stop to think about it, what they're saying is we need people who score on IQ tests of 135 and above. And then when you stop to say what proportion of the population is that, you realize that most people can't do those kind of jobs no matter what. So the idea of guaranteed basic income is what all three of them have suggested. And have any of you done any work looking at that? Because we're going about it as if we assume we could bring in a better job base. But just looking at indifference curves and looking at budget constraints, you know, UAPB trying to keep up with Harvard, you know, they would just move the budget constraint out. And then we forever chasing Harvard. But the capital income ratio is steady moving along in terms of how those who have assets, who have capital, will be getting a larger piece of the pie as time goes on.
Take a stab at
Yeah,
it?
take one, go for that.
There's a lot of content in your question there. And I think one of the things you said at the outset, if you look at some of the ratios that Piketty and his co-authors have, and how that will ultimately lead to complete agglomeration of wealth. And I think that your point is that you made is that won't happen because those are what economists call endogenous variables. Those are things that are determined within the system. So I think it can be misleading to think about those as the driving forces that are leading us inexorably toward disaster, that when a process is unsustainable, it will cease at some point. Now, as far as the outlook for jobs, I mean, I think and what we're seeing in income inequality right now has been, there are examples of it throughout history, that whenever new technologies become available, there are opportunities to get rich, and some people are going to take those. I don't think we should begrudge people who are making innovations that are improving our lives, improving the applications of technology to consumer goods, but at the same time we have to be careful that we're not also rewarding rent seekers, those who would exploit government programs or other loopholes in our social system to benefit at the expense of everyone else rather than as innovators and bring something of value to us. On the guaranteed basic income, that has been proposed as a solution to a world in which there are no jobs left, and we need a better way to share the profits of our industry. I don't think we're there yet. I think it's premature to consider that as a realistic option. Although I do think that if we were to replace a wide range of a patchwork of social safety net programs with something more comprehensive like that, we might gain in some sense in economic efficiency. I guess those are some of my thoughts on
Well, they actually
things.
tried to justify it on the basis of, you know, people are free to do the entrepreneurship and they get ready to go, you know, full-time at it. But I guess what I'm saying is I think there's some problems that we overlook when we just paint the big picture, but there is something moving on. And then when you look at Congress and say, what is Congress doing? In other words, the idea in his book, he suggests tax policies. But when you look at what Congress is doing, Congress is saying, well, basically, we're gonna have some tax cuts, but we're gonna do it at the expense of those who are already, you know, in the deep mess.
Well, when you talk about taxes, I think that really gets to the issue of rent-seeking behavior, and we want to make sure that I think some of the principles that are in Dr. Hopperdahl's book here on tax reform are relevant both at the state and the national level. We want a tax system that efficiently raises income, raises revenue for the government, one that has a broad base and low rates, one that doesn't distort economic decision-making in unproductive ways. And I think whenever we look to the tax system or government action in general to solve some social problems, there's always the danger of unintended consequences and encouraging those kind of unproductive activities that we don't want to have emerge.
Just one comment. I'm gonna agree with almost everything you said, except there's sometimes a different we. When you keep saying we this, we that, there's a different we, and that's partly what the congressional struggle is about. Two different ideas of who we are. Okay, I'm done.
Awesome. We're gonna share the wealth, share the microphone.
Question back here. Thank you very much. My question, my query rather, involves, I think, a statement that was made earlier relative to workforce development and skill sets. And, you know, we often discuss Arkansas workforce and skill sets to indicate that as a state, obviously, we're not prepared to the degree that we should be. However, my question is, when does this hypothesis about the workforce skill sets really become an excuse not to do anything? And I've been back in Arkansas again now for, I guess, 10 years at this point. And in government and in academics, it's always the same statement that's made. Now, prior to returning to Arkansas, I recall that there was a proposed automobile plant that was to be built someplace north of Memphis, between Memphis and Platteville, I believe. I think that was the date. And I remember at Indiana University that we were reviewing some of those things, reviewing that proposal. Ultimately, the plant was moved to Mississippi. Now, I don't see a real, and I know where those plants are located, I don't see a real difference between skill sets in that particular demographic that I find in Arkansas. What makes the difference here?
I could actually speak specifically to that project. So that project actually, in that specific instance, Arkansas was being used as leverage. That plant was always going to Mississippi. Mississippi had the land that they were going to give to them. And actually, that same company had a JV location in Northeast Arkansas that if that company would have gone there, they would have been, taken away from their own workforce. So their JV partner would have lost the employment because those people would have then gone looking for jobs at their other JV partner. They would have inadvertently become competitors for their own workforce. So you see this a lot in the South. You see a lot of shopping around, and a lot of times we have to realize sometimes we're just being used as leverage because somebody else, that's where they're going to go anyway. And when you're talking about a really large workforce, you have to look at what is already in that location. For example, we had a company come here 6 months ago, and they were going to build another plant, and it was a joint venture, exact same story. They already had a plant here that did a very similar thing. They would not build here because they did not want to compete against themselves for that workforce. So a lot of times it's sheer numbers. You have to look at the population of an area and how many people are there and how many employees do you need. But as you talk about workforce, I really see this as an opportunity. And I think that it's something that the state of Arkansas is taking very seriously. I know that we're taking it very seriously. And if we can jump out ahead of this, because the thing about workforce is this is not an Arkansas problem. This is not a Delta problem. This is an America problem. It's not even an America problem. I was in Shanghai 2 months ago, and the #1 conversation was about workforce. This is an international issue and the skills gap that's there. So I think Arkansas has a really good opportunity right now to spend the money, to figure out where we want to get in and work at a very young age, middle schools, junior highs, high schools, and come back in towards more skills training and vocational training. Follow the lead of Germany, where, in Germany, people who work in factories are more respected from a very early age. Those people are looking at those jobs as higher paying. So if we can rebrand this, spend some money, I think we could do a really good job there.
So I hate to cut the conversation off, but I guess we are at our
No.
time limit, right? So I'd like to thank the panel very much for volunteering their time.